Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's meeting with 14 leaders from the troubled state of Jammu and Kashmir on Thursday was prompted by several factors, the two main ones being his acute awareness of his personal stature having significantly diminished internationally over his callous handling of the second wave of the coronavirus pandemic and signs that the Biden administration may be leaning on him to restore some measure of political normalcy to the state. This is the broad overview of Tarun Basu, the well known New Delhi based journalist and president of the think tank Society for Policy Studies, which, among other activities, runs a respected online journal, South Asia Monitor. Writing a remarkable curtain raiser to the Thursday meeting, Basu also says, and I quote, linked tangentially to a political decision on Kashmir are the tangled web of Afghan peace talks, with New Delhi reported to have conducted secret parleys with the Taliban as the latter steadily moves toward its goal of controlling Afghanistan once more. Unless Kashmir moves towards democratic governance and New Delhi is able to reach some kind of modus vivendi over it with Islamabad, it will remain vulnerable to extremist influences and spillovers from the notorious Afpak terror sanctuaries, unquote. Quite extraordinarily, Basu also says there is little doubt that Islamabad was tipped off about the likely happenings in New Delhi in a way to force the Modi government's hand. Tarun Basu is a veteran Indian journalist who was the founder editor of the India Abroad news service, which later became IANS. IANS, under his leadership, became India's most respected newswire. Basu is currently the president of Society for Policy Studies, a New Delhi based think tank which, among other things, runs the South Asia Monitor, an online journal focused on South Asia. Mayank Shah Reports spoke to Tarun Basu, who offered a broad South Asian diplomatic perspective on the Prime Minister's meeting with Kashmir leaders.
Tarun, welcome to Mayank Shah Report. It's a pleasure to have you on. First, give me a broad stroke impression of the meeting that took place between the Prime Minister and the 14 Jammu and Kashmir leaders.
Mayank, first, thank you for having me on the show. I believe this is quite a popular show. Yesterday's meeting at the Prime Minister's residence at 7 Lok Kalyan Marg, which took place between the Prime Minister and 14 other political leaders from Jammu and Kashmir, was the first political meeting that the Prime Minister was having with Kashmir's leaders in 22 months. So that itself was very, very significant, And, the August 5, 2019 decision scrapping the special status of the Jammu and Kashmir through abrogation of the Article 370 and 35A were in a way watershed moments in the then state's history. And that state has had many such watershed moments. So, but, even the decision to have this meeting had really taken a lot of people by surprise. I mean, nobody expected it, and about a week before, or 3 or 4 days before the meeting, there were some reports that there's going to be such a meeting, which was planted. But before that, nobody had an inkling that there was going to be such a meeting. But what is curious about this whole thing, Pakistan seems to have had some inkling, and at least, 15, 16 days before that meeting, Pakistan started sending out their foreign office, their foreign minister, etc., series of statements, maybe 3 or 4 statements leading up to the meeting, where they said that India was going to bifurcate, divide, and change the whole structure of the state again. I'll tell you, they talked about division, bifurcation, and demographic changes. And they said they've already, further illegal occupation of Kashmir must be stopped. Then the foreign minister of Pakistan, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, he even wrote to the UNSC, the UN Security Council, telling them or red flagging to them that, look, such a thing, we have got wind of it, would have happened, an appeal to world parliaments, the UN, international media, human rights organizations, and whoever else they could appeal to stop India from doing what they call further illegal and unilateral measures. So they feared something, as if India was, or the Modi government was to further going to break up Jammu and Kashmir, or maybe divide it more along, community lines, or trifurcate, or I don't know what. But nothing like that happened. And, where Pakistan must be pretty disappointed because, and then, there was no great declaration. There is no joint statement. There's no major pronouncement. Modi didn't have a press conference. He never does. But the importance of this our meeting, which went on for, according to newspaper reports, close to 100 minutes, was that the intent shown by the government, after all that had happened in the last 2 years, and the last 2 years, as you know, the state, the Kashmir became a federally controlled territory, not a state. And then Ladakh was taken away from it, so it just became a smaller union territory. It was directly governed from Delhi through a lieutenant governor. And there were a lot of restrictions, internet restrictions, there were a lot of curtailment of civil liberties. Dozens of political leaders and activists were put into jail, including 3 former chief ministers and so many others, and people are still in jail. So a lot of things had taken place, and although the Modi government had conducted pretty successful, what I call grassroots democracy, elections that, took democracy down to what they call the grassroots,
Right.
the district development councils, and they were pretty successfully held, although the turnout was not so high, because the terrorists and extremists and militants, they had all warned people who either were candidates or came to vote that there will be serious consequences. But the good thing was people braved many of these threats and had come out in some places in large numbers to vote. And by and large, these so-called grassroots elections were fairly successful. And one of the reasons that the government did that, one was told, was to break the political oligarchy. There were the few clutch of, as you know, political families, the Muftis, the Abdullahs, and
Right.
a dozen others, which control the politics of Kashmir since the Kashmir integrated with India, or became part of India, or acceded to India, rather. That's the better word. And so the government wanted to break the stranglehold of these political parties and had these elections. And then after that, a lot of other relaxations took place. The internet was in stages. They were restored, and things were leading up to some kind of normalization, but there was no talk of restoring democracy as we understood it in Jammu and Kashmir. But then after the release of these 3 former chief ministers, first Omar Abdullah, then Farooq Abdullah, and then Mehbooba Mufti was last, after almost a year of detention, people were expecting something, but then came the pandemic, and everything was, things were, decision making or anything else was almost suspended. And then this whole invitation came, which took everybody by surprise.
Right.
So what the Prime Minister basically said was nothing much, actually. He asked the political parties to participate in the delimitation process, which, as you know, would mean redrawing of constituencies because of demographic changes. And this has not taken place for 25, 26 years. And then he said his priority was to have elections, which does not mean that immediately the Kashmir will become a state. It still has a legislative assembly. It had a legislative assembly when it was, this whole thing happened. So the idea is to have a first have election and then possibly, have a roadmap towards restoring the statehood and, well, anything
Right.
else that goes with it. So
Right.
that's where things stand after yesterday's meeting. So
Okay.
there, what I want to stress is there's no great declaration, joint statement, announcement, nothing like that.
Right.
Just says the Home Minister and the Prime Minister just said they had a good meeting, and both sides said the meeting was very cordial, and the Prime Minister gave a very patient hearing to everybody, and they were very happy about it. And then that, the democracy, restoration of democracy in a phased manner will happen. That's all that
Yeah.
came out
Yeah,
officially.
that's an excellent segue for me to your rather remarkable piece on South Asia Monitor, where you had a sort of a curtain raiser on the meeting. You talk about the fact that the idea that the Prime Minister has been under so much criticism because of his handling of the pandemic. This meeting perhaps was a trigger, may have been a result of his wish to create some sort of a distraction where he comes across as a decisive figure about to reinstate democracy in Jammu and Kashmir. What do you think of that perspective?
Well, I would imagine, as a kind of an analyst of this political situation here, that there were a lot of political and diplomatic forces at work and the changing circumstances of the region that contributed to this, announcement about the meeting and the possible outcome of this meeting. I mean, true, the government had come under a lot of pressure, and it had got a lot of negative play internationally because of its handling, or rather mishandling, of the pandemic. And it got very bad international media and international attention, negative media, international attention, and it showed the government and the country in a pretty poor light. So there was, and before that, all that happened, Modi could do nothing wrong, and he was above reproach. But this kind of really was a big blot on his 7 years of governance, and there was a lot of talk that and speculation that he's under a lot of pressure to make some positive announcements,
Right.
so-called positive announcements. And coupled with that was again the flux in the neighborhood, this whole of Pak region, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the feared Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. They're already controlling 50 districts there. Today, they're meeting, the Afghan leaders are meeting President Joe Biden at the White House. US talking to Pakistan because Pakistan is a key interlocutor, and US needs Pakistan support to be able to completely withdraw from Afghanistan, number one, and at the same time to keep a watch on Afghanistan in the future. And they need some kind of a platform or a base or a watchtower from there. So I mean, everybody is making their moves at the moment here, and I can imagine Pakistan, which is a key player in Afghanistan, in whatever dialogues that are happening for the future of Afghanistan, is trying to extract its pound of flesh, if I may put it that way, to be able to derive the maximum benefits from whatever role either the US or the EU or other Western countries or even China wants Pakistan to play there. And Pakistan knows, in one way, Pakistan was the creator of the Taliban. But Taliban is now a Frankenstein which has gone completely out of control. And Pakistan is very afraid of that. So, Pakistan obviously, it also wants to change its bilateral dynamics with the US. All this time, the whole accent on the relationship was geopolitics. Now suddenly we hear from Pakistani leaders, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, even the Army Chief, that the accent now will be on geoeconomics. So it wants a different kind of relationship with the US. And I'm sure that in terms of the US wanting something from Pakistan, in terms of a kind of a transactional situation,
Right.
or they might be working, okay, we'll give you this, and so we would like some give on Kashmir.
Yeah.
So even the ceasefire that came into effect in February, which was in a way brought about by UAE, but I think US had a
Role
remote
in it, yeah.
role to play in that. All this part of this larger chessboard, that the great game that is again the
Right.
new great game that is going on in this region, and I would say Kashmir is part of that.
It's fascinating you mentioned that because it that does not portend well for India if the US or the Biden administration is going to lean on the Modi government to somehow settle down Kashmir. It's not something that ideologically, politically, culturally that Modi would like to do.
Well, Modi also would, he's also completed 7 years. There were 3 more years left. And all prime ministers, as you know, would like to, have a legacy and a kind of a positive legacy at that. And, Kashmir has been a millstone around every leader's neck. And how much progress in that way you can make, because, previous prime ministers who tried to make quick progress on Kashmir in terms of having a kind of a modus vivendi or even a rapprochement with Pakistan have had a bad experience.
Right.
So even Modi tried to do something and have a patch up with Pakistan, but he also had a bad experience. So I'm sure he's going to take slow but measured steps. But there have been positive vibes also from Pakistan in the last few months. So let's see how all these forces and moves, how
Right.
they fall out in the pan out in the coming weeks and months. It will be very interesting region to watch, South Asia.
Right. In the specific context of Article 370, it's my sense, sitting afar and as well as having covered Kashmir for a long time, that now it's a fait accompli. There is no going back on it. Modi is not going to even mildly dilute that part. Even the Kashmiri leaders have resigned to that fact because they also want to get back to power. What is your sense of Article 370's abrogation? Is it written in stone now?
Yeah, I don't think there is anything going back on that, because
Okay.
the revocation of Article 370 and integrating Jammu and Kashmir into India is part of the BJP's ideology and even the previous Jansang from decades, and only Modi had the courage, so to say, in
Yeah.
going ahead and doing it, which previous prime ministers were unable to do from the BJP's perspective. So I don't think there's going to be any dilution or even turning back the clock on this revocation.
Right.
That is, I don't think, not on the table. Although Mehbooba Mufti and I think Farooq Abdullah have also talked about that, and that is more for their constituency back home, playing to the gallery that their only agenda is revocation of 370. But that I don't think is on the table at all, and that's not going to happen.
Again, this question you and I have talked about for quite some time, and you also reported significantly in the 90s about the idea of converting the LOC, the line of control, into an actual international border now. Do you think with Kashmir settling down into post 370, that could again become a possibility, or you think BJP will feel compelled to harp on its idea of the entire Kashmir being part of India?
See, that is a far-fetched idea at the moment. I know it was one time being talked about 25, 30 years ago, but that's a very, very far-fetched idea. It's almost a fantasy now. And I mean, there are several steps that could foreseeably happen in the near future and over months if things go according to plan. Because again, for every positive step in terms of towards normalization, there always have been two steps back, in the sense there always have been disruptors who have tried to derail that normalization process. There are forces in Pakistan and maybe possible in extremist forces in India which do not want normalization. So, there are, if the delimitation happens as the government wants, because when the delimitation commission was meeting in the last few months, sections of the political parties in Jammu and Kashmir, National, did not take part in the proceedings of the delimitation commission. But maybe now, after the meeting of the Prime Minister, they will be part of the delimitation commission. So once the delimitation is completed, there is an expansion of the assembly, which will go up to 114 seats or something, I'm told, and or even more. Redrawing of the boundaries. The first thing will be then the announcement of elections. Now again, there are lots of ifs and buts. The elections have to happen peacefully. There has to be a good turnout, reasonable turnout for people to accept it and for the world to accept it, that it was held peacefully and free and fair elections were held. And then the government might think of restoration of statehood and bringing back a semblance of democracy, democratic functioning in Jammu and Kashmir. So those are, steps which would take at least through the year or into next year, even through the year. So, that what you're talking about, that's a very far-fetched thing. And this, it will be premature to talk about things in there, because we are not talking about any solution between India and Pakistan at the moment. We are talking about just rapprochement between the government and the alienated political parties, the political establishment in Jammu and Kashmir. Nothing more than that. Nothing more than that. And again, it may or may not happen.
To wrap up, it's interesting that the Prime Minister should have the gumption to talk to leaders whom he jailed for a long time, and those leaders too didn't mind showing up. Doesn't that tell something about both sides?
It does. Well, that is politics. You have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. I mean, you was Farooq Abdullah, who was in jail for detention at home detention for over Mehbooba Mufti, then Umar Abdullah. They all came and they all participated, and whatever their private feelings, they all spoke positively to television, to media about the meeting, and everybody said that it was very cordial. The atmosphere is very nice, and the Prime Minister gave a positive hearing, and they all said, almost without exception, they expect positive things to come out of it. So that's all the takeaway can be. It's all sentiments and feelings without major announcements. It's all about sentiments and feelings. And yesterday's meeting has left, for the first time after a long time, positive feelings among both parties that something good will come out of it.
Now,
that's all can be said at the moment.